Good morning, Moray Rabotai. We are continuing on Hilchot Tefillah, Siman Sadi Aleph of Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, and Seif Bet, and in regular prints of Mishna Berura is on Daf Kuf Chaf Dalet Amud Bet of the Mishna Berura. This is a very interesting and important halacha that stems from the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat Daf Tet Amud Bet and the Tosafot there and Daf Yud. The Gemara says that a person has to have a belt when he davens. You can't just daven with a regular gown, the way their clothing were in the time of Chazal, without a belt. You have to have a ezor. Sarich le'ezor, ezor b'shat ha'tefillah, afilu yesh lo avnet, she'en libo ro'eh et ha'erva. Even if you have halachically taken care of libo ro'eh et ha'erva, and you have a hefsek, you have a division between your heart and your erva, still, for tefillah, you have an additional requirement to have an ezor. Mishum, why is it? He called likrat elokecha Israel. The pasuk says you should prepare yourself for your meeting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He called likrat elokecha Israel. You should prepare yourself when you go to greet Hashem. Aval sha'ar brachot mutar levarech belo hagora. But the rest of the brachot, you could say without chagor. We spoke about, the hospital gowns and so on and so forth. If let's say if you're in a hospital, and a person is not wearing undergarments and you just have the gown, you cannot say any brachot. You cannot say Shema. But if you have, let's say, undergarment, it's tightly around the person's waist, so then you could say Shema. We still mentioned that for tefillah it's going to be more challenging if the upper body is not properly covered and so on. And if you're a Shalach Tzibur, it's even more important to be completely covered, not to be short in shorts, so to speak. But here we're talking about an additional level of kavod for tefillah by having a belt on. Now, what does that translate in our day and age? Is everyone required to do like the Hasidim do with the gartel? Or that's why the gartel is there, by the way. The reason that the Hasidim wear a gartel is because of this seif in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Sadi Aleph, seif Bet. Is that a requirement for everyone? How about wearing a belt? So let's study a little bit of the Mishnah Berura together and see what the Achronim have to say. First and foremost, Chafetz Chaim writes, if you davened without it, you're yotze. Right? We already said before an apparent stira between Seif Aleph of Siman Sadi Aleph and earlier on in Siman Ayin Dalet in Mishnah Berura itself, whether or not he paskins like Pri Megadim or like those who are Mekel, that by a Derabanan, if you already b'diavad davened, you should be mekel. So even though that here, the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berura rather, seemed to have been more stringent, that if a person davened without having a hefsek between his heart and his erva, he should maybe go back and daven again. Based on the Pri Megadim, earlier on, he sided with those mekelim that anything that's the Rabbanan, if you already b'di'evet, you already have daven, you don't have to go back and repeat it. Chacham Ovadia Yosef also in a Tshuva in Ktav Yad says the same thing, that anything that's the Rabbanan, having a hefsek between your heart, libo ro'eh et ha'erva is a isur the Rabbanan. So if you were over on that, if you didn't have a hefsek between libo ve'erva, Ovadia says you could be mekel mikaradin, not to have to go back and daven again, but he said you should daven that you make a conditional extra tefillah, that if I need extra tefillah, it should be my hiyuv. If I already very yotzeh, as you said, the tefillah, then it should be a voluntary tefillah, and you add something to ask that you usually do not ask for, and that would be his psak. But nevertheless, here Mishnah Berura right away says that if you didn't have a belt, then you don't have to go back and daven again. You're yotzeh b'di'evet. V'yesh omrim od davka mi sheragil kol hayom b'chagora. There are additionally those who say that this chagora business is for somebody that always wears a belt. So to not wear a belt, that's considered disrespect to tefillah. It's lack of preparation for tefillah if that's your regular attire. But if you don't ever wear a belt, then he doesn't have to wear it in the time of tefillah either. There are those who say, Umihu, at the end of the day, says the Mishnah Berura, mitat chasidut af bechai gavna. The Magen Giborim writes that at any scenario, any person, even those who usually wear suspenders, so to speak, they don't have a belt, the chatchila, a person should have a belt as an additional hachana for the tefillah. Now, says the Mishnah Berura, avnet, even though that you have avnet that separates the heart and the erva, רצונו לומר אבנט של מכנסיים המפסיק בין ליבו לערווה. When you have מכנסיים, and the מכנסיים has, is tightly around your waist, or you have a belt tightening it around, so on and so forth, that's considered already hefsek between heart and the erva. משום hikon לקראת אלוקיך ישראל, איתה בזוהר. He brings from Zohar in חלק ג' in פרשת בית חנן, דף רס"מ, מן דקאים בסלותה, בא אליך עשוי רשע ואינוי בגין דלא יסתכל בשכינתה. This is the Zohar that I have mentioned several times that the Mishnah Berura brings. Here we have it. A person that davens, says the Zohar HaKadosh, בא אליך עשוי רשע, he must cover his head, ואינוי, and his eyes, begin דלא יסתכל בשכינתה, in order not to gaze at the Shekhinah that is present in front of a mitpalel. And the Mishnah Berura says that you should do it with talit shel mitzvah. וכן נוהגים כהיום לחסות ראש עד עיניים בטלית מצווה. And the minhag of the time of Chafetz Chaim in Europe was that actually would be meshalshel the talit, they would bring the talit over their head. Nowadays you see many of the people who want to be careful based on the mekubalim, that they do that to cover the talit, and it comes a little bit down to the face as well, but that's for Kabbalistic reasons of the Orot HaElyonim, or a Makif, or a Penimi, and so on and so forth. But even aside from the Mekubalim, says the Chafetz Chaim, the minhag in Europe was to cover their head and coming down to their face a little bit, betalit shel mitzvah, at the time of Tefillat Shemona Esrei. And this is something that, way back when, already from the time of the Pri Megadim, has been the minhag. Now, man de pakach enoi, continuing in the language of the Zohar HaKadosh, in Parashat Vayet Chanan, someone that opens his eyes in the time of Tefillat Shemona Esrei, b'shat tzaloteh, maktim aleim malach hamavet, chas v'shalom, will be an opening for negativity. Ve'ayim b'siman sadiyeh, b'mishnah berura. Later on, in Siman Sadiyeh, he brings more of this language of the Zohar HaKadosh, that perhaps a person will not be zochet to see the Shekhinah and so on and so forth. But before we get into this, let's finish the Mishnah Berura, that you could say she'ar berachot, if you have avnet, if you have some sort of hefsek between the heart and the erva, you could say Shema, you could say the rest of the brachot. והוא הדין קריאת שמע, זה לא שייך hikon לקראת אלוקיך. Hikon does not apply to the preparation, special preparation for tefillah, only applies to Shemona Esrei. When you stand in front of your king, and again, even though the tefillah may be the Rabbanan, according to the Ramban, and Kriyat Shema, the Oraita, still the kavod that's necessary for tefillah is more intense for tefillah than for Kriyat Shema, because you're standing omed lifnei HaMelech, כי אם כשעומד לפני המלך, מכנסיים והוא הדין עם בגדיו מונחים דבוקים ממש על הבטן, ומפסיקים בין ליבו לערווה. Says the Mishnah Berura, you don't necessarily need to have a belt. If you have, back in the day, they didn't have like tight clothing like we have nowadays. Back in the day, they had gowns basically. Underneath there, everything was open. And even if you had pants, the pants were not necessarily tight. They were, they would make them one size fits all. And then you had to, with a belt, compensate for the larger size that you had in order for it to stick to your body and not fall down, right? Either they did it with that or with the suspensor. So suspenders. So if you have a beged that is tightly around your waist, that's considered already libo eno ro'eh ta'erva, which again, nowadays everything is fitted. Nowadays everyone buys garments based on their size. So unless you are on a regiment that you're losing weight faster than you could buy new clothing, then you maybe have a question. But if it's fitted, then you don't necessarily need even a belt for saying Shema and the rest of the brachot. So if you have already that, then the belt could be an additional kavod and act as not an avnet, but as a gartel or as a ezor that the Shulchan Aruch says over here. You don't necessarily need a gartel, even in simply put. But the chatchila, you would need to have a belt for tefillah then. Right? Because you have the libo eno ro'eh ta'erva already by having a fitted pants, and we have undergarments as well nowadays. But the additional belt that you put the shat tefillah is not just additional help for putting your straps of tefillin around it, but it is also good for acting as the ezor, as the requirement of hikol nikrat elokecha Israel, and as additional belt that you have for kavod of the tefillah. Now, the Or Etzion, Chacham Etzion Abba Shaul, he writes that nowadays that the garments are fitted, you don't necessarily even need an ezor. It's only for the time of Chazal, which they had a gown, that this was a necessity, because you looked like a shlomp if you didn't have an ezor. You looked like a lazy person. You didn't look like a zariz, that you're at the edge of your seat, ready to jump, ready to go. And hikol nikrat elokecha Israel would be when you put that additional thing that, right, by Korban Pesach, he says, kacha tochlu oto. You have to do it with zrizut, with alacrity. You have to be ready to go. Kacha tochlu oto. Motnechem chagurim is the first thing he says. Na'alchem beragnechem u'makelchem biyadchem v'achaltem oto bechipazon. Part of having zrizut was motnechem chagurim, right? That your belt is on, is ready to conquer the world. So it says Rabbi Shaul, nowadays it's not necessarily, it doesn't look like a shlomp if you don't have a belt. Certainly if you don't have a gartel, without a gartel you look like a shlomp. No, you don't look like a shlomp. So it says Rabbi Shaul, it's not necessarily needed anymore in our generation. But again, we mentioned before that the Kaf HaChaim says that when you have the extra belt, the extra gartel, you look like a zariz more so, and therefore it's not just in the time of Shemona Esrei, but even by saying Kaddish and so on and so forth, still would be a necessity. And the Kaf HaChaim says, it's not just the attire of having a belt, it's also the attire of the way you're dressed and the way your hair is, not covering your mouth and not covering your ears, and so on and so forth. There's something that Gemara says in Masechet Brachot, that the Rav Yehuda would beautify himself before the tefillah. He called Nikrat Elokecha Israel. He would make sure that his tie is proper, his shirt is proper, his jacket is clean, his pants are proper, because you're standing to daven in front of Ribono Shalom. You should be prepared according to the kavod that's necessary for Omed Bifnei HaMelech, based on that generation and the place you find yourself in. Now, we mentioned that at the end of the day, Mr. Berura said is midat chasidut, that the person should have the izor, should have the additional belt. And the fact that, again, nowadays Rov Klal Yisrael don't have it is probably explained best with the piece from Chacham Ben Abba Shaul that we just mentioned, that again, the attire is different, the minhag is a little bit different, and still, Chatchila, Midat Chasidut would be that a person should at least have a belt for davening. So here again, you have a nafkamina for those people who they need or they like to have suspenders instead of having a belt. For the tefillah would be l'chatchila. If you have a choice, you're mindful of it, you remember it, it would be best to have a belt for the tefillah, even if you're wearing fitted clothing that are properly around your waist without a belt, but still lechatchila midat chasidut would be to have a belt as well. Or again, for those who put a gartel for tefillah, that would not be a necessity to have a belt any longer. That would be serving as the additional ezor that the Shulchan Aruch is talking about over here. And
how about just adjusting the belt a little bit just for just adjust?
You don't need to adjust it more to choke yourself. It's not an additional mitzvah to need to go to gastroenterology after tefillah. If it's fitted around your waist, that's considered already doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's not going to be an additional thing if you just tighten it one closer hole. I'm not sure if that's going to do anything really. But again, you see from the Mishna Berura that the minhag in their time was that they covered their forehead as well, their face up to the eyes, based on the Zohar that the Mishna Berura brought in Pashat Vayetchanan. The Kaf HaChaim over here says that the minhag is not to do that. Well, now again, based on the Mekubalim, you have those who cover at least the tefillin of Rabbeinu Tam, but there are those who also cover tefillin of Rashi because of Or Hamakif covering Or HaPnimi, which Or Hamakif is the talit, Or HaPnimi is the tefillin, and so on and so forth. But there are those who don't do that. Even Al Pi Kabbalah, says the Kaf HaChaim, the minhag is not to do that necessarily in the time of Shemona Esrei, but the Zohar at the same time says that a person at least should, even if you're not covering your eyes, mamash covering, you should not be gazing, you should not be opening your eyes, as we're going to discuss in Siman Sadihei later on. And if you must open your eyes because you have to see something that's going on around you, or for any other necessity, then the Ben Ish Chai writes that you should not be davening at that moment. Stop the davening. Pause, do whatever it is that you need to do if you have to check for some emergency or what else, and then you close your eyes and you go on with the tefillah. So this is something important to keep in mind as well. You don't want to be like those who are davening at the same time, like they're like a revolving camera monitoring everything that goes around them. That's not a proper kavod, aside from the Zohar. What kind of kavod is that? It's a disrespect to the tefillah, and also the eyes of a person are the source, the greatest source of information, and you don't realize it yourself, but your brain is scanning everything that's around you and processing the information that's being scanned. It takes away from the intensity of a person's kavanah. That's one of the reasons that driving is one of the most tiring activities. You drive for 4 or 5 hours, and you find yourself completely drained. You did nothing. You're just sitting in an air-conditioned car, but because your eye and brain correlation, they are measuring distances and speed and lanes and changing lanes, especially if it's a busier road. There's a lot of millions of calculations that have to be done that your brain automatically does, and you don't realize it, but it drains your koach. The same thing is, when your eyes are open, your brain is busy doing things, and it takes away subconsciously from the kavanah, the intensity of kavanah that a person must have during the course of the tefillah. We're going to start one more little thing over here. The next seif also is one of those important seifim and well-known seifim perhaps in Shulchan Aruch. Says the Maran in Seif Gimal, that those who say you cannot mention Hashem's name with an uncovered head, you have to have a kisui rosh for mentioning Hashem's name. And there are others who say also additionally they cannot enter the shul without kisui rosh. Even if you're not saying anything, you're just entering to call somebody, you can't enter the shul without yarmulke, without kippah. Of course, this is very relevant, especially for kiruv activities and also for Sephardic custom, the old minhag of many countries of the Sfaradim, Edot HaMizrach, has been because of the dangers, like really dangerous thing to go out in the street with the yarmulke. So what they had was, they had, just like you have a box of talit, and they had also a box of kippot. You came in, you put the kippah on. Outside, either you had your private kippah in your pocket, or you didn't, but people didn't walk necessarily in the streets with the kippah. This, we briefly spoke about it in Siman Bet earlier on, in the very beginning of Shulchan Aruch, of the halachot of kisui rosh. Is it a necessity? Is it a chiyuv? Is it not a chiyuv? Was it a chiyuv in the time of Chazal? Is it a chiyuv perhaps now? We mentioned that probably, you see from the Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Chavtet, from Gemara in Shabbat Kuf Nun Vav, and other places, that it was not a full-fledged chiyuv to have a kisui rosh for everyone, at least. Chacham Ovadia says nowadays is an obligation for every frum Jew, because that's what differentiates between a person that's committed to Torah mitzvot with a person that's not, and therefore he says it's an obligation for everyone to walk around with kisui rosh and not to just go out like that. But nevertheless, however you slice that, when you were saying a bracha or you're learning, saying azkara, you're saying psukim, you have to have kisui rosh. When you enter the shul, you must have kisui rosh. Now this opens door for, of course, a lot of discussion. Some of them we just mentioned, for kiruv activities and so on and so forth. You have to pass out kippot. They come into the shul. They should not be without the kippah. And also for women, when they're learning Tanakh, they're saying Tehillim. A girl that's not married, or a woman that's married but at her home, does she have to have a kisui rosh when she says she's learning Tanakh? Or when they daven, they're saying brachot, because Shachar, the girls in seminary, they're having a Tanakh shir. Chacham Ovadia was very strong that you absolutely need kisui rosh for a girl that's davening, for a girl that's saying Tanakh, even if she's not married. Others disagree, and that becomes a very relevant seif in Shulchan Aruch, even though that's a very short seif, becomes a very relevant seif, which Be'ezrat Hashem we will be discussing in the days to come. Zak Baruch.
We have it.